Thank you so much for being here with us this evening, and I will pass it over to Nathaniel.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for sharing your evening with us tonight. As you can tell, you are being joined not just by me, Nathaniel Stinnett, the executive director, and Irene, who you just heard from, but also Shannon, Peter, and Ren from the EVP team. So everybody will be doing a little bit of presenting tonight. There'll also be folks answering your questions in the Q&A. For those of you who are just joining us, you can put questions in that Q&A folder. Please don't put questions in the chat. You're not going to be able to, even if you try. We're going to be putting links in the chat. Put your questions in the Q&A folder. If they don't get answered, just know that's probably because they're being held for the Q&A session at the end. I am really, really excited for tonight's event. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here and start not just by thanking all of you again, but by thanking all of our host committee members. Many, perhaps most of you are here because one of our host committee members harangued you to come, and maybe they got you to donate. And so I want to thank you for being harangued, and I want to thank them for being the haranguers. We had different tiers of our host committee. I'm going to scroll through all of them. We are enormously grateful to you all. There are too many to name, but I do just want to highlight in particular that many people gave in memory of Lee Balance, an extraordinary man who many of you know through his activism and generosity with Citizens Climate Lobby and also with the Environmental Voter Project. And so I do just want to recognize that many of us miss Lee, who passed away a few months ago, and many of our hosts and donors gave in Lee's memory. We have an extraordinary and quick event for you tonight. And as I think some of you know, if you've been to EVP events before, I like to kind of lay it out before we get started so you know what's coming. So in a few minutes, I am going to start by giving a very brief, not a brief, but a very, very brief overview of what we do at the Environmental Voter Project in case there are new people on the line here. Then Shannon Siegel, our organizing and field director, is going to answer by far the most popular question that we get asked, which is, do these postcards that volunteers write actually work? And how do you know? And how much do they work? She's going to get into all of the data with you guys. Then I am going to go through the next phase of the Environmental Voter Project. Just like we've been digging through a lot of our messaging and postcarding data, we've also been digging through a lot of our impact data and our expenditures data, and we've got a really good idea of what our sweet spot is and where we can go over the near term and the long term. Then Shannon's going to give you 4 ways to make an impact right now, and I'm going to close by asking for you to donate. And yeah, we're going to ask you to donate a lot tonight. We're going to be putting a lot of donation links in the chat because this is a fundraiser, but it's not just any fundraiser. It's a fundraiser for an organization that gets proven results, which unfortunately is far too unique in today's political environment. And we need your support to make it happen. All of this is going to take roughly 45 minutes, at which point you're welcome to leave. I mean, honestly, you're always welcome to leave. But at that point, we will start an optional extended Q&A. We won't take it personally if you drop off at that point, but that's when we're going to start that extended and optional Q&A. So that's what you've got coming. Let's go ahead and get started with this very brief introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. In a nutshell, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is getting people who already care about climate and the environment, yet they don't vote, to start voting. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote and we get them to start voting. Our whole MO is that we're trying to bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is changing people's opinions and changing people's minds. We don't want to do that. We don't want to try to convince people to care more about climate change. There are great organizations that already do that. Instead, we want to find the people who are already there. They already list climate as their number one priority over all others, yet they're not voting. And then we mobilize them to vote. Now, for some of you, that might sound like a very narrow niche, and it's certainly narrowly defined, but unfortunately, it's not narrow when it comes to the number of targets we have. The reason we are so focused in this particular area is because there are a huge number of these non-voting environmentalists. Based on our data in our 21 states and our calculations and projections in the remaining states, we believe that 11.2 million already registered voters, or already registered, skipped last fall's presidential election, and all of them were people who listed climate and the environment as their top priority. I'll say that again. Over 11 million climate first registered voters just skipped last fall's election. And it isn't like they were all in unimportant places either. You can see in these 5 crucially important swing states last year, the numbers of non-voting environmentalists, so these are already registered voters who list climate as their top priority and just stayed home, the numbers of those people were larger than Donald Trump's margin of victory in each of these swing states. And in Georgia, it was 4 times larger. These 11.2 million super environmentalists who aren't voting represent an enormous opportunity for us. At a moment in time where everybody is scrambling for political power, these are people we can identify and mobilize, and we've got the receipts to prove it at EVP. It's a 4-step process. Again, I'm not going to go into lots of detail because this is a very brief introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. But quickly, the 4-step process is this. 1, identification. We need to find these non-voting environmentalists, right? Polling and just going off of polling data is way too imprecise. On the other hand, we obviously can't talk to like all 300 million individual adults in the United States. So we need to find somewhere in the middle, but still manage to be really precise. And the way we do that is by building what's called predictive models on voter files. Again, I'm not going to get into the details here. We can share a short video, an explainer video in the chat for those of you who want to learn more. But in short, what these predictive models on voter files enable us to do is individually identify people on voter files who are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority. This is an individual targeting technique. And then it's public record whether you vote or not. So it's really easy to weed out the environmentalists who vote and just focus on the non-voters. That's when we go to step 2, mobilization. At that point, we don't even need to talk about climate change to these people. We can just use whatever cutting edge behavior change messaging works best at getting these non-voting environmentalists to vote. And so that's what we do. We work with over 7,000 volunteers to canvass and call and send postcards to these voters. We run direct mail and digital ad campaigns, and we run hundreds of experiments measuring which of these interventions work best with which subgroups of these voters to do one thing and one thing only, and that is get them to start voting. Step 3, habit reinforcement. We don't just focus on the big, sexy elections every 2 years. We are trying to build up the electorate. And in order to do that, in order to truly change people's voting behavior, you need to work year-round. And so we, I kid you not, are going to end up being active in probably 480, 490 different elections just this year in 2025. Because ultimately, our goal is step 4, and that is to change the electorate. We know that nothing motivates politicians more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so if we just stuff the electorate with as many climate first voters as possible, politicians will follow, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they want to win elections. We've been getting extraordinary results doing this. This year, we are active in these 21 states, and we are targeting 7 million of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists. 7 million of them. And again, we know them by name and street address. Very briefly, Our results show that in randomized control trials, and Shannon's going to tell you about those in a little bit, EVP has been solely responsible for increasing turnout in a huge number of elections, big and small, in 21, in 22, in 23, in 24. We have increased turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in presidential general elections, 3.8 percentage points in other statewide elections, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And those are huge numbers in this business. Over the long term, we have now communicated with 12.8 million unique individual voters, all of whom were pretty crappy voters, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them. And as of a few months ago, 2.2 million of those non-voting environmentalists had become such consistent super voters that they had voted in their most recent federal, state, and even local election. They were super voters. Just a sample of the upcoming elections that we're looking at over the next 7 weeks. 2 public service commissioners in Georgia. These are the people who regulate utilities. It's enormously important for the climate movement. A transit ballot measure in Charlotte County, Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. Obviously, the big gubernatorials and mayorals and the Supreme Court races in Pennsylvania, and many, many more. But this is the work that we do. These are the receipts that we have. And in short, we know how to get millions of values-aligned non-voters to the polls. We've been doing it in big and small elections for years now, and we've got the receipts to prove it. With that, I'm going to make the first of many asks for you to donate tonight. There will be a link in the chat for you to donate, and donate generously. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shannon to talk about postcards.
All right. As Nathaniel mentioned, we don't just decide which voters to contact because we think it sounds cool or we think you'll have fun. As our organizing and field director, I want it to be cool and I want you to have fun. But at the end of the day, I'm only going to ask you to do things that make an impact. So now we're going to talk about postcards. So I love this question. I love that you all know EVP well enough to be asking us this type of question. You are the right volunteers and donors for us because we're ready to answer it. So at EVP, we mobilize voters in 5 different ways. These options on the left, phone calls, door knocking, and handwritten postcards, are done by our volunteers. Many of you are on the call tonight. In addition to those 3 modes, we also do direct mail, that's like letters or fully printed postcards, along with digital ads sent to folks' devices. We combine these in some elections, and in others we pick, 1 or 2 of them. So today we're going to be focusing on postcards, and I'm going to speak to you about isolation experiments where we only send volunteer postcards, along with some where we layer multiple of these methods together. So, as Nathaniel mentioned, our gold standard of measuring our results is using what's called randomized controlled trials. The first step in an RCT is having our full population of low propensity environmental voters. Those are the folks that Nathaniel just told you we talk to. What he didn't mention is that in all of our voter contact, we actually set aside a small control group of voters who we don't contact. These are folks that are similar. They're also low propensity environmental voters, but we randomly select some of them to not be contacted so that after an election, we can measure the differences in these RCTs. So we have these 2 groups. Our treatment group gets our voter mobilization messaging. So that might be postcards, phone calls, door-to-door canvases, multiple of these things together. And the other group hears absolutely nothing from EVP. They have their election. And then after the election, we cross-reference public voter files to see how many people voted from our treatment group and from our control group. And that allows us to see the difference in voting turnout between our treatment, who we contacted, and our control, who we didn't. And then we measure these results at a level of what's called statistical significance. So we only report out to you the results that are typically 95% confident that EVP is solely responsible for whatever impact we're reporting. That means it's at a 95% confidence interval. Some results, and we'll kind of highlight that in the report, are at a 90% confidence interval, but we are very, very certain that the results we report out to you are due to EVP's contact alone. With our volunteer postcards, and those of you that have been joining us for at least 2024 and 2025 will be familiar with all three of these. So that's loss aversion, trending norms, and friends and family messages. And I'll dig into what each of those means in a moment. We're starting off with loss aversion messaging. The idea behind loss aversion is that we as humans are much more likely to be afraid of losing something than we are to care about gaining something. Kind of similar to this idea of like sunk cost, you know, we really, really, really don't want to wreck something that we've already started or lose something that we already have. We're averse to that loss. So here's an example of a loss aversion postcard design. And Ren on our team actually designs all of our postcards. Here's the front and here's the back. And this is going to be consistent across all the designs that I'm going to show you. This blue and orange text is pre-printed on the postcard along with our return address. And the information in green is what our volunteers hand write on the postcards. So I'm going to walk you through the anatomy of this loss aversion postcard. So first, I'm going to highlight the actual handwritten message. So thanks for being a good voter in 2024. Keep your good voting record by voting in the 11-4 Virginia general election. These are postcards that actually 400 plus volunteers mailed today. This is a real example from this upcoming election. And you'll see on the front, we kind of repeat that thank you for voting in 2024. Now, an important caveat is these are all voters who did vote in the 2024 presidential election. I'll talk to the types of messages we use for voters who didn't, but that part has to be true. We can't just be lying to voters. So we thank them. Who doesn't want to be thanked? Everyone loves that. But with that thank you, there's a little bit of social pressure as well, right? Because how do I know that they voted? Well, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote is public record. That is like our gold star social pressure messaging that we use as much as we can at EVP. It's the subtle note that even though I'm a stranger, I know whether or not you voted, and it's important that you vote. So this is the handwritten part that makes these loss aversion postcards in the front design different from our other postcards. In addition to what's handwritten, I'll walk you through the other pieces. So we have an elections website, as well as the voting methods printed on there, again, so that there's no confusion. Once we rope the voter in with this handwritten message, who doesn't love a handwritten message, then they can look up and see all the other facts that they might need in order to actually be able to cast their vote. We have that social pressure message right at the top, our gold standard, and we have an additional election information as well, just so that there's no confusion about what the election is or when voting happens. Our return address. And finally, you'll see this on our postcards. We also use this similar framing with our phone banks as well, where we always have folks identify themselves as volunteers. There's evidence that shows that identifying yourself as a volunteer actually makes the message a little bit more impactful, because the person on the other side knows, whoa, this isn't someone getting paid to do this. This isn't some money, whatever. Like, someone is spending their time to tell you this because it's really important, because they think it is important enough to volunteer their time to give you that information. So we always have folks sign off as a volunteer. Now, here's the results. For these loss aversion postcards, you're looking at 6 different experiments where we only sent people a postcard. 1 volunteer postcard with the loss aversion message similar to what you just looked at. In these, 3 of them met that high degree of a statistically significant result. So you see we have between 1.3 and 1.5% increases in turnout of those voters who did receive a postcard compared to the similar voters who did not receive a postcard. The 3 bars that you see in gray all suggest that those campaigns were impactful as well. However, we were not able to meet that degree of statistically significant confidence that these impacts were solely due to EVP. Now, that might be confusing. You see Colorado and it looks even higher than these others. This has to do with the treatment group, kind of how many people were in that treatment group. So you'll see for all three of these in gray, the treatment group was under 15,000 voters, which just means that results even of a similar impact to the ones in green means we just can't say with confidence that it was not due to additional factors. But it's great news that all of these 6 standalone experiments show positive increases in turnout. And that doubles down when we look at multi-mode campaigns. So as I mentioned at the top, we have these 5 different voter contact methods, and these 4 are opportunities where we layered those together. I can say specifically for Tucson, we did volunteer phone calls, postcards, and volunteer canvassing. So volunteers on this call might have been involved with all 3 of those. And we possibly included other methods as well. But all 3 of these in green were statistically significant impacts that included these loss aversion postcards. So I think Tucson is a really good example of what we see in an odd year when we can layer these methods on top of each other. 2.7, we feel really, really good about those results. So loss aversion postcards, they're our gold standard. We have a lot of data that shows that they're impactful and impactful in different election contexts. However, they can only be used with people who actually did vote in a recent election. And since we're talking to low propensity voters, we don't always have people who voted in an election recently, like people we talked to in a presidential year. So that's where these other 2 come in. Our trending norms messaging. So we first tested this message with a printed postcard. This was not a volunteer postcard. We had it all done at the print shop and sent off to see if it worked before we asked our volunteers to do it. So trending norms is leveraging something similar to social pressure, where we're saying society is moving in a certain direction here. More people are voting in Texas every year. You don't want to be left behind. No one wants to be the last person not voting when everyone else on their block or all their friends are voting. So we're leveraging that feeling of not wanting to miss out. And then on the back, again, this is fully printed. We have similar messages to what I showed you on those last postcards. So in this direct mail experiment, we saw a 0.4% increase in turnout of our treatment voters versus our control. Again, that's statistically significant. So we know that these postcards have the potential to make a positive impact. That's where we then brought our volunteers in. We really wanted to use this message in 2024 because, again, we're talking to people who were unlikely to vote in a presidential. I can't thank them for voting recently because they haven't. Instead, we're going to remind them that all sorts of other folks in their state are voting and they want to be part of that rising tide. So on here, we'd written each year more Virginians vote, don't be left behind on November 5th. So again, similar repeat to that message on the front. Because it was a presidential year, we didn't really want to do too many isolation experiments because we don't want to leave any voters on the table. We want to talk to voters as many ways as we can, as many times as we can. So these are 4 multi-mode campaigns. So again, that had postcards as well as other types of voter contact. And interestingly, in both Arizona and Texas, we saw once again a 0.4% increase in turnout of our treatment voters versus our control. So again, since these weren't isolation experiments, we can't say for certain that it was the postcard alone that made this impact, but we do see that when combined with other methods, at least, these postcards have the potential to be impactful. All right. Friends and family messaging. This is an interesting one that we actually first experimented with back in 2021 with texts. So those of you that have been with us since then might have sent that text. So this is another one that we tried to use in 2024 when we weren't able to use that loss aversion messaging. So super simple, super eye-catching. Make sure your friends and family vote. I'm going to tell you a secret. I don't know who this person's friends and family are. I don't know whether they're already good voters. I'm not measuring that. Instead, we're using this idea of friends and family to make this person into a bit of a role model. or I think what we use in our report, we say a deputized norm enforcer. We are putting this person on the inside with us. We're saying, you know, it's important to be a good voter. Making that statement that this person is like us, they think it's important to be a good voter. Make sure your friends and family are good voters too. Now, this example reminds me of like, you know, I may or may not jaywalk if there's no cars coming by. But if I see that there's a little kid waiting with their parent and the kid's trying to cross the street, I am not going to be a bad example and jaywalk in front of this little kid, right? So this is a similar idea. Even if this person wasn't planning to vote, now that we're saying it's your responsibility to make sure other people that you care about vote, it actually is likely to increase their chances, or that was our theory, that it would increase their chances of voting as well in order to be that good example for other people. So we did a standalone experiment in the North Carolina presidential primary. We had the suggestion of an impact there, but that was not statistically significant. But in our multi-mode campaign in Nevada, we did see a 0.3% increase in turnout in a campaign that included these postcards. So we don't really have enough evidence here. We haven't tested this enough to be able to say with certainty that these postcards create an impact, but it might be something worth exploring again in the future. So many of you have postcarded with us. You've already donated your time, and many of you have donated your resources as well. I'll tell you, it's important to us that our postcarding program be accessible, even to people who cannot afford to provide their own stamps or make a donation to cover the costs. That is very important to us. Many organizations require volunteers to provide that. We don't. But we need your support in order to continue this very successful program. It is expensive, even with the donations from many volunteers. So we really invite you to make a donation and help support this impactful program.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who have donated to support our postcarding programs and to all of you who have volunteered for our postcarding programs. I know many of you have been asking, does this work? I know we send out our reports, but we really wanted to present this data to you as well. All right. Now I'm going to be talking about a different kind of data. Just like we care a lot about testing the effectiveness of certain voter turnout interventions like calling and canvassing and postcards and digital ads, we also want to measure our organizational efficiency. And as we've looked at each phase of EVP over time, we have always made sure to maintain both that effectiveness and efficiency. And we're at a crucially important moment, not only in our country's time, but also in our organization's time. And the second big sort of discussion that we want to have at the event this evening is what this next phase of the Environmental Voter Project is going to entail. First, let's see what got us here. For those of you who don't know, we started the Environmental Voter Project almost 10 years ago to the day. Now, we didn't really start it, it was a proof of concept, but on October 1st in 2015, we launched a 15-month proof of concept in Boston, Massachusetts, testing, hey, could we accurately identify non-voting environmentalists and then prove that we can get them to vote? And could we do it in elections big and small? And we killed it. We knocked it out of the park. And so in 2017 and 2018, we launched for good. January 1st, 2017 was our true launch. We rapidly went into 6 states to see, okay, let's see if we can attract volunteers, raise the money to do this stuff that we already know worked in a small pilot program, and have it work at a much larger scale in more states and in bigger elections, like, say, the 2018 midterm. And once again, we killed it. Then we were off to the races, expanding and excelling. We wanted to be able to get to more and more states. We wanted to ramp up our budgets. We wanted to recruit thousands more volunteers and rigorously experiment to make sure that our messages were always working and that we were always being both effective and efficient. Now, Why is this important? It's important because since our beginning, EVP has grown responsibly and consistently over time. And in a boom and bust ecosystem, where most voter engagement nonprofits have had a lot of trouble over the past few years, this responsible growth has not only been pretty unique, but it's been really good for all of you as donors and volunteers, because responsible growth means efficiency. We haven't been distracted, and we feel very grateful for this. We haven't been distracted by layoffs and restructuring and then rebuilding and then reorganizing and then refocusing. And that has allowed us to just focus on creating new voters. That's where this laser focus on effectiveness and efficiency can get us, and it's where that responsible growth can get us. But as we've been looking at the data, which, as I think you know, EVP always does, we've discovered something pretty extraordinary, which is right now, in the fall of 2025, the most responsible thing that we as an organization can do is double or maybe even triple our size. And I know that sounds weird. I imagine some of you are probably rolling your eyes like, oh, wow, a nonprofit that wants to get bigger. Surprise, surprise. But as I think many of you probably know, we don't have trouble saying no to people. There have probably been many of you who have asked us, hey, why don't you expand into this state or that state where we could honestly have gotten a lot more contributions? And we've said no, because our data told us that we wouldn't have as big an impact as some other organizations could. Or there have been some of you who have said, oh, why don't you do this method of voter contact or that method of voter contact, which, let's face it, would have gotten us more volunteers and more donations. And we've said no, because we've looked at these randomized control trials that Shannon was talking about, and we haven't seen that those methods of contact actually work. We're not scared of turning down money. We are happy to say no because we remain laser focused on being effective and efficient. But right now, our data is screaming at us that we need to say yes to getting really big, really fast. And there are 3 reasons why. And after I give you those reasons, I'm going to go through some slides detailing these points. First, it's easy. It's easy. We think we can double or even triple the amount of our expenditures without having to hire a single new person. 2, it's efficient. As I will show you over to the next slides, we think we can spend almost 3 times as much over the next year and a half with only increasing the cost of getting an additional vote by a teeny little bit. So to put it another way, every dollar we spend to get a vote over time gets more expensive, right? Spend $1 million to create X number of voters. If you spend $5 million, maybe you won't get 5X, maybe you'll only get 4.5X or 4X voters. Well, what we've realized is we're nowhere close to the point where we start losing that efficiency. And then the third reason why we think now is the perfect time for us to expand and expand rapidly is it meets the moment. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that the democracy crisis and the climate crisis are spiraling out of control. And when you've got proven results, an ability to scale, and the opportunity to use these proven results at scale right now, not next year, not next presidential, but right now, well, then I would claim it would be irresponsible not to. And so this is why over the next 16 months, you're going to be hearing us talking a lot about how we are trying to get bigger. I don't necessarily mean in more states. I mean in the existing states where we are. Okay, so let's walk through why we think this. First off, just at a very top level, we are an enormously, extraordinarily efficient organization. Just looking at last year, but you can see all of our annual reports, and it always ends up looking like this. But if we could put a link to our most recent annual report in the chat, you'll see. We spent 91% of our expenditures on either mobilizing voters or identifying the voters that we were going to immobilize. We spent very, very little on management, administration, and fundraising. What goes into those voter turnout expenditures? Well, 5 sets of things. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail on this slide. Hopefully you'll be able to see the information. Volunteer phone calls. Just because they're volunteers doesn't mean that it's free. Digital ads, both display, video, and it's not in there, but audio ads as well. The volunteer postcards that Shannon was discussing, volunteer canvassing, and direct mail. Now, I want to be clear. We have the capacity to scale up all 5 of these methods of voter contact pretty darn efficiently. We would be happy to get 10,000 more volunteers in the door in the next month. Maybe we couldn't handle that without hiring, someone, but like we could handle it pretty darn well. Same thing with ramping up volunteer canvassing and to a slightly lesser extent, the postcards. But what is really, really easy to scale up is digital ads and direct mail. And this is why I was alluding to earlier that we think we can double or even triple our expenditures without having to hire a single person. You know how we ramp up our direct mail and digital ad program? Me typing a few extra zeros and hitting return on my keyboard. That's pretty much it. It takes almost no additional time or energy from the organization. And we're seeing this in all of our data, because in some elections we go small, in some elections we go big, and we can measure the comparative impact when we do that. And we see we have enormous room for growth that doesn't require a lot of friction, and it doesn't require hiring a lot of people. Okay, I want to spend some time on this slide because I think it's really, really important. The presidential election, the next presidential is in 3+ years, so we're not thinking about that yet. But when we look at 3 categories of elections, municipal elections, odd year statewide elections like the ones coming up this fall, and midterm elections, we see 3 lines that kind of move in unison, right? And so the way you read this graph is, along the bottom here, that's the amount of money we spend per target voter. Let's say we identify 50,000 targets in New York City. Well, on average, if we spend about $1 per target voter, we could expect to be solely responsible in our randomized control trials for creating a certain number of voters. And then at the end, we do some very easy division and we see, okay, we were responsible for creating this many voters and we spent this much. That means it cost us about $20 to create an additional vote. And it's a little bit more expensive to do that in statewide elections because the higher the baseline level of turnout is, the more expensive and harder it is to get someone to vote. And it's even more expensive to create a new voter for midterm elections. But you'll see there's something really interesting here, which is the more we spend per target voter, regardless of the kind of election that it is, it doesn't start moving up. It doesn't start getting really expensive to create an additional voter until you get in this $2 to $2.50 range per voter. We think this is really important information, and we dug through a lot of data to get it. But let me show you where we currently are. Typically now, we are spending in this range. Some elections, depending on the type of election, we're spending 10 to 15 cents per target voter. Others, if it's a really important election, we're spending closer to $1.50, $1.75 per voter. But our average is right in there. It's less than $1 per voter, which is way to the left on this sort of plateau of efficiency. We think we can get much further to the right. we can spend much closer to $2 per target voter before we start losing efficiency. This is where we want to be. We want to be spending as much as possible before getting to the point where, you know what, it starts getting more and more and more expensive to create an additional vote. We think this is the sweet spot that we need to be in, especially because it's so easy to scale up to get there and because of the enormity of the moment. What does this mean? Well, if we look at odd years, 19, 21, 23, and 25, it means we still have room to almost double what we have raised this year and spend it efficiently over the next 7 weeks. Looking ahead to next year, it means we think that we could efficiently spend $11.1, $11.2 million without moving beyond that area of efficiency, that sort of range of efficiency there. And what would this get us? Well, first, just to be clear, what we are saying is this next phase, it is a rapid growth phase. We want to 2 to 3 times X the amount of money that we spend. So that means we need to raise double or triple the amount that we have been raising before. And what would this get us? Well, this fall, just using results that we have already gotten in the few elections where we've spent that much, we could add over 8,000. We could be solely responsible for adding over 8,000 brand new voters to the electorate in New Jersey, over 5,000 in the statewides in Georgia and Virginia. Looking at next year in some really important elections, we could make an enormous difference. And again, I'm not projecting based on results that we've never gotten before. This is based on results that we have gotten in the past, just when we're able to spend over further to the right of that graph. We know we can do this if we get the money. And so I want to encourage you again, please don't just invest generously. Take a moment to go into the chat, click the link, and make a donation. You can donate by credit card. There's also a link to donate by check, wire, or stock donation. Now I'm going to hand it off to Shannon, who's going to give you some really, really easy actions that you can take now to make a difference.
I know you all are feeling jazzed up, ready to go, and I'm going to tell you what to do. Here's where you can funnel that energy. As Nathaniel already mentioned, donate generously. I'm not just saying that because we're at a fundraiser. I'm saying that because that is the way for us to make a bigger impact. We know it works. We just have to do it more and do it better. And consider becoming a monthly donor. This work cannot happen if we only get late cycle investments. We need to be doing this work year round in all different types of elections. Like Nathaniel mentioned, we've already mobilized voters in literally hundreds of elections this year, and it's only September. So when you become a monthly donor, you say that that is important. You say that you want us to continue doing that year-round mobilization, not just parachuting in a few weeks before an election. And I'm our organizing director. I'm not just going to ask you for money. I'm going to ask you for your time too. Help us launch early voting in Virginia. The very important Virginia gubernatorial election is on November 4th, and that election actually starts this Friday. In-person early voting begins. Then many of you sent postcards today for this same election, and now we need your help calling these voters. So help us start off strong, get some voters out of the way. Let's get them out to vote. And lastly, we already have published our final Get Out the Vote phone banks for this election season. So we're calling voters at 17 shifts between October 31st and November 4th. I guarantee there's at least one that fits your schedule. So help us get across the finish line by mobilizing those voters in those last 5 days. The link is going to be in the chat for that as well. All right, Nathaniel.
Well, thank you, Shannon. I was too quick to thank you. We are right on time. I am going to make a final closing pitch here. First, thank you. Thank you again. So many of you have already donated, and I hope that you take enormous pride in these results that we are getting, because they're your results too. We couldn't be doing this work without you. And all of the great results that we can prove that we are getting is happening because of you. So thank you. Thank you. I would be remiss if we got through any discussion of politics without acknowledging everything that's going on right now. You don't need me to talk to you about most of this, but clearly the stakes are bigger than I think they have ever been in any of our lifetimes. And obviously, many of us are frightened, and a lot of us are frustrated that the politicians we expect to lead are not leading right now. And I get that. I get your frustration. I have conversations with many of you about this. And I'm not going to suggest to you that the Environmental Voter Project has all the answers. Obviously, we don't. Of course, we don't. But at a time when we have so few answers to so many enormous problems, I think it is worth stressing that we do have one solution to one really big problem, and that is getting the right people to vote. Whether it's postcards, canvassing, calling, direct mail, digital ads, presidential, midterms, statewides, locals, we have proven time and again that we know how to get values-aligned people to the polls, and we have the receipts to prove it. And we are now at a moment in time where we can look at our data and know that we can scale up without losing any efficiency. And so, please, I know you are here because you share these worries. I know you are here because you have a desire to make an impact. And I am telling you, you don't need to wait. You don't need to wait for the midterms. You don't need to wait for the next presidential. You don't even need to wait for 7 weeks for election day. We are doing this stuff now. As Shannon was saying, we had 400 plus volunteers drop over 100,000 postcards in the mail today, like just in the past few hours. We are doing this work right now. And so our 45 minutes are up. And I'm going to close by just letting you know we have a $500,000 goal for this event tonight. When we came into the event, we were about 66% of the way there. Please take the time to donate, and donate generously. Not because you like us, not because you view us as a charity, not because you view it as a good deed, but hopefully because you view it as a match for your values, a match for something that you want to accomplish right now. We are getting this work done. So please go into the chat, open the link, and make a generous donation. I promise you we're going to keep on reporting back to you with the results. And I know that you will find value being a part of our work. All right. What we now have is a Q&A session. It is optional. I know that after 45, almost 50 minutes on Zoom, many of you have had enough. We're not going to be insulted if you drop off now. However, oftentimes we hold webinars and having just a 10-minute Q&A isn't enough for people. We've got lots of questions left over. So we'd like to have a special thing and have an optional extended Q&A after this. So for those of you who would like to stick around, please keep on putting your questions in that Q&A folder. For those of you who are leaving, thank you so much. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you to our staff. Thank you to our incredible volunteers. Thank you to our donors. Thank you to our board for all that you do to make this work happen, and donate generously. Now is not the time to wait. Thank you, everybody.
All right, Nathaniel. We got no time to waste. We have a lot of questions. Folks are paying a lot of attention, so I hope you're ready.
All right, bring it on.
All right. Big question that came up from a few different people, especially looking back at what happened with the 2024 election. How do we know that we are targeting the right voters? How do we know that these voters are voting the right way?
Great question. And I'm very glad that people feel comfortable asking that. We know for a few reasons. So first, let me just reiterate, we are a nonpartisan organization. If you are looking for a fully partisan organization, that is not us. We are a nonpartisan organization. We target people who list climate and the environment as their top priority, regardless of their voter registration. However, there is some information that we know and some information that we don't know. First, let me say what we don't know. We don't know how people vote. Nobody knows that. It's secret. If anybody ever tells you they know how people vote, they're lying to you because it's secret. We don't know that. But there is some secondhand information and evidence that we do have that I think will put some people at ease. First, remember, we are not mobilizing people who kind of sort of care about climate and the environment. No, we are only mobilizing people who in our validated predictive models are likely to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority over all other issues. Not most other issues, but all of them. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. Those are the people we are targeting. So that's the first thing that I think should put people at ease about how might these people be voting or what values will they have when they vote. The second thing is, and again, I want to reiterate that we are nonpartisan, but there is some publicly available information that is certainly worth mentioning. In the last presidential election, exit polling data not only asked, hey, who did you vote for? It also asked a whole bunch of other questions. And these exit polls were of enormous numbers of people, 115, 120,000 people. And one of the other questions they asked was, what's your #1 most important political priority? And what was useful there was not just that we saw that only 7% of people who voted listed climate as their top priority, which is a bummer, but we could then cross-reference those two groups. We could see, okay, who did people vote for if they listed immigration as their top priority? Who did people vote for if they listed abortion rights as their top priority? And who did people vote for if they listed climate as their top priority? Why is that of interest to us? Because those are the people we're mobilizing. We are only mobilizing people who list climate as their top priority. And when you looked at who those people said that they voted for, they broke harder for Kamala Harris than any other issue constituency group broke for either candidate. So to put that another way, people who listed climate as their top priority broke harder for Kamala Harris than even immigration first voters voted for Donald Trump. In fact, in some swing states like North Carolina, these climate first voters even broke harder for Kamala Harris than registered Democrats did. Now again, I want to be clear. We are a nonpartisan organization. Regardless of your voter registration, if we have a really high level of confidence that you list climate or the environment as your top priority, we are going to mobilize you to vote. But we're really confident that those people vote with those values, and that not only leads to electing people who are going to lead on climate, but it changes the electorate itself. Because we all know that even if we do elect the so-called right people, it isn't like they can then just snap their fingers and get everything they want done. No, they still need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on, and they ain't going to choose that issue that's only getting 7% in the polls. And that's why it's so important to flood the electorate with these people. So very, very good question. I obviously know why people want to ask about this, but we've got Lots of great data on it.
All right. Lorna and a few others asked related questions about, okay, they know some people that they wish had joined the webinar tonight. How can they get this information to those people and get those folks to donate to EVP?
Wow, great question, Lorna.
And Lorna is real, I promise.
Awesome. Okay. We will be sending out a recording of this entire webinar and the Q&A tomorrow to everybody on our email list. So watch your inbox and you can send this to them and ask them to donate. On top of that, if they want to get involved, we are going to have an enormous number of opportunities. And Shannon alluded not just to Friday's launch of phone banks into Virginia, but we're going to have something like 40 or 50 phone banks using this proven messaging to mobilize voters over the next 7 weeks into tons of different elections. And you can go to the Get Involved link that's in the chat. And I would encourage people who want to learn more about EVP to come to one of those. Because before anybody talks to a voter, Shannon and her team and our amazing volunteer leaders tell you about EVP, train you, make sure you're really comfortable, not just with what you are going to say in the script that we give you, but why you're going to say it. The final thing I would just say is on our YouTube page, we have lots of videos that are shorter than this webinar recording is ultimately going to be. And there are lots of really great sort of quick explainer videos there, Lorna. A 6-minute intro to EVP, a 8-minute explainer about how we target voters, a 10-minute explainer about the behavioral science that goes into our messaging. And those might be really, really of interest to any friends of yours who might have missed tonight. So thank you. Thank you for asking about that.
All right. So you talked a lot about what it would cost or what it could cost for us to scale up in our existing states. What's the price tag on adding a new state?
Yeah, good question. Well, sorry to be that guy, but it depends, right? California is more expensive than Idaho would be. Let me provide some background. When we think about what states to work in, and this isn't just when we're thinking about expanding to new states, it's when we think about should we continue working in our existing states. We consider 3 criteria. First, is there a disproportionately large population of non-voting environmentalists in that state? We want to have a really large population of targets, or else it kind of doesn't matter how good we are at what we do. That's why we're not in a state like, say, Montana. We've had tons of people ask us to come into Montana. Remember I was talking about how we say no to people all the time? Well, people have tried to throw money at us to go into Montana, but we say, no, give it to some other group. They could have a bigger impact there. There aren't that many targets. And so that's the first criteria we look at. The second is, do they have elections in odd years and even years? Because remember, we're in the habit forming business. We work year round and we want there to be lots of different elections for us to have opportunities to talk to people. And the third criteria, we don't just care about moving climate policy at the federal level, we also care about moving it at the state and local level. So we're active in red states like Nebraska and Louisiana, where a lot of really important local action on climate can make an enormous difference. We're also active in bluer states like Massachusetts or New York, because boy, take it from 2 Massachusetts people right here, can we tell you they've got a lot of room to go in being true climate leaders. And we've got big cities like New York and Boston who have mayoral elections, and big city mayors can be good climate leaders. So that's the background of this decision that you asked about. That's how we think about which states to expand into. A state like California, because we want to be able to work year round, year in, year out in those states, we would have to feel pretty comfortable that we could bring in an additional $3 million each year just to spend in California. A smaller state that in the past has made sense, Ohio doesn't really count as a small state. Let me use a different example. In the past, Washington State has been a possibility for us. That would probably be much less. We'd probably have to look at additional cash flow and feel pretty confident that we could get an additional 750,000 each year. But I don't want to mislead you by so directly answering your question. We need to balance any expansion with, well, what would an extra $750,000 mean if we just stayed in our 21 states? Or might we look at our data and decide to leave one of our current states? That's always a possibility. The truth is, the ultimate goal of the Environmental Voter Project is to put ourselves out of business. We are in the problem-solving business, and hopefully we will solve this problem. Maybe not all at once, but if in particular states we start seeing fewer and fewer of these non-voting environmentalists so we can get off the sidelines, it is certainly possible, if not likely, that we will decide, it doesn't make sense for us to be in that state anymore. And so there's a lot of considerations, but top of mind is always what Shannon and I have been discussing tonight, which is how can we be both effective and efficient? Because it is what you expect, but it's also what we expect. We aren't doing this just for our health. We're doing it because we really want to be making a difference as well. So that's the process that we would go through.
All right. So speaking of efficacy, I obviously highlighted our postcard efficacy. I got two related questions on that note. One, do we have any data that explicitly compares volunteer postcards and other postcards that are fully printed? And then the second, do we have like any kind of data that we can report out on digital ads?
Great questions. So let me take them in order. One piece of data explicitly comparing volunteer written postcards to a really close approximation of that postcard was in what Shannon presented in our trending norms piece in Texas that we did last year, where I believe it was a 0.4 percentage point increase in turnout over our control group. We have not, I believe, gotten an isolation experiment proving that in isolation, those volunteer postcards boosted turnout. But that's not because we have tried and failed. Rather, it's because, as Shannon mentioned, we were looking for things that we could use in a presidential general election year last year. And our gold standard message, loss aversion, which Shannon brought through, we knew that we couldn't use. Loss aversion only works if you are telling people who just voted in a higher turnout election, oh, you better vote in this lower turnout election again. Well, nothing is a higher turnout election than a presidential general. So leading into that, we thought as a team, how can we run some experiments with paid postcards to try to give our volunteers something that we think works? But it's a very good question. Do we have a true apples to apples comparison between paid postcards and volunteer written postcards with that? No, we don't. We likely will by the end of this coming year, would be my guess, or at least the elections. I'm sorry, not this year, the end of next year. Next year, we will be running some experiments with this. So stay tuned. We have not done that with loss aversion mail. I don't believe. Actually, you know what? We have. Now that I'm saying that. Hey guys, okay, please put in the link. Sometimes I just need to talk and the answer falls out. Sorry, folks. Please put in the link. There should be a report on our loss aversion mail piece, gosh, that I think we did in 2022 or 2023. There we go. May 22, impact of loss aversion mail. So we do have, thank you, Peter, for putting that in the chat, some comparison of loss aversion mail versus these loss aversion volunteer postcards. So you can look at that. As far as advertisements testing the impact of digital ads, really, really great question. Some of you may remember earlier on this year, we said this was the thing we were most worried about and that we wanted to do the most experimentation on. We now have very old data that is now, I believe, 6 years old, proving the impact of digital display ads. So these aren't videos, these are just static ads. That's too old for comfort for us. We also have some of these multi-mode campaigns that we obviously can't rely on because we're mixing digital video ads with some other things. But the results are so significant, so big, that they lead us to believe that we're pretty confident that those video ads are working. What we are not confident in is whether static display ads can boost turnout on their own. And so we are experimenting a whole ton with that this year. We ran a big A/B message experiment in Georgia earlier this year. And poor Peter, who's in the chat giving you guys links, has to deal with me sending him messages. Shannon's laughing because she sees these messages in the Slack. There's the frowny face. I'm asking Peter, when are we going to get the Georgia data? When are we going to get the Georgia data? Because we know it's back. So we ran a big A/B experiment testing 2 messages versus a control group with 2 different types of display ads. And we did it with an outside firm because we also like to have outside groups validate our results sometimes. We haven't gotten that data back. The fact that we haven't gotten it back yet, though, isn't keeping us from running even more display ad experiments over the next 7 weeks. We are going to be running experiments in Texas. We are going to be running digital ad experiments, not in New York City, but in the remainder of New York State. We are going to be running digital ad experiments in Colorado. We like finding big states that have low salience, kind of low turnout elections, because it means we maximize our opportunity to identify messages that work well and boost turnout. But as you're probably guessing from the way I'm answering your question, the fact that we are running so many experiments is because we still doubt not whether video ads drive turnout, we're pretty confident they do, but whether these display ads do. And to tell you the truth, we've been challenging a whole lot of other organizations kindly and privately, but we've been saying, do you have any experiments that prove these work? And no one has been able to prove to us that they work. And it kind of bothers me that we're the only ones trying to figure this out, but I promise you, we will figure it out. And probably by next February or March, we are not going to have 1 experiment. We're going to have 4 or 5 experiments, including probably 7 or 8 different messages that hopefully will get to the bottom of this, because I don't want to be spending any money on digital display ads for next year's midterms if we can't prove that it works.
Thank you for that. All right. This is a classic question. This time it's from Carolyn. And I think a lot of people are probably wondering, why aren't these climate people voting, Nathaniel? Why won't they just vote? Why do we have to be doing this?
Yeah, I know, Carolyn. I know. I share your frustration. Okay, so there are some things that we've gotten a lot of clarity on here very recently. So before I even start to answer your question, Carolyn, I'm going to ask Peter to put in the chat a link to our recent polling report where we were struggling to answer this same question, Carolyn. And if you'll grant me a minute or two in prelude to answering your question, I think it will be helpful. I think it'll be helpful to sort of go through with a history of how we've tried to answer this question. First, it's really hard to know for sure why people don't vote. Because when social scientists ask people, hey, why don't you do this thing that society views as important, whether it be voting or exercising or eating healthy or getting vaccinated or this, that, or the other thing, a really strong bias enters into the equation that ruins your data. It's called social desirability bias, which is a really fancy way of saying like people lie their pants off and tell you what they think is the most socially acceptable excuse for not doing this thing that deep down they know they're supposed to do. And so it's really hard to figure out why people don't vote or why environmentalists don't vote. And up until recently, all we could do was guess at a few things. Yeah, there were some demographic correlations. Environmentalists tended to be younger people of color, and those demographic groups voted less often, but that's changed a lot recently. Over the last 2 years, our target populations, a lot of young men no longer list climate as their top priority, and they're not in our target population anymore. And so these demographic things that we had relied on to try to answer that question no longer hold true. And so what we tried to do starting about 3 months ago was put together a really unique poll because we wanted to figure out, could we get at answering this question, Carolyn, while eliminating that type of social desirability bias that I mentioned? Could we try to get these answers from people while eliminating all these biases? And we did it by fielding a poll about 6 weeks ago that was really uniquely designed in two ways. The first way that it was uniquely designed was it used what's called split samples. This was a huge poll. I think it was something like 3,000 people, maybe 3,200 people that we polled. But they didn't all get the same questions. They were separated into distinct groups. One sample only got asked questions about climate change. The other sample only got questions about abortion. The other sample only got questions about immigration. And you can see where I'm going here. The purpose of that was we didn't even want to let these people know that they were getting a political poll. We didn't want to prime them to start thinking about these issues in a political context because we thought that in and of itself could yield biased results. We're trying to figure out why people don't vote. Maybe we shouldn't be automatically assuming that they view all these things in a political context. So that was the first unique design aspect of this poll. The second one was we asked open-ended questions, by which I mean, for most of our questions, we didn't give people a list of answers to choose from. Now, it's a hell of a lot cheaper when you do it that way, when you give people a list of answers to choose from, because then it's really easy to collate the data. It's much more expensive to just say, hey, how many times each week do you think about this issue? And then you just look at all the results and collate them with our pollsters. That's much more expensive. But again, it allowed us to bypass a lot of bias that comes when you force a set of already chosen answers upon people. All right, I've taken a long time to answer your question, Carolyn, but now I will, I promise. We came to realize some extraordinary things when we got this polling data back. First, Americans think more about climate change each week than they think about abortion or immigration. Two issues that, let's all face it, we all know are much more politically salient than climate change. But when you ask people open-ended questions and you do it in a way where they're not already primed to be thinking sort of about politics, it's more of a natural setting, people report thinking about climate change much more often than these politically more important and salient issues. They also report thinking that climate change is more important than issues like immigration or abortion. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Americans think climate change is a more important political issue than immigration. They don't, not by a long shot. Nor do they think it's a more important political issue than abortion. But they think it's a more important issue. And I think you can see where I'm going, Carolyn. Then we started asking open-ended questions about when you think about ways to address X issue or Y issue or Z issue. And remember, people were only asked about one issue. Something extraordinary happened. By an almost 4-to-1 margin, the solutions that people came up with off the top of their head for addressing climate change were completely apolitical. Completely apolitical. They had nothing to do with politics. You want to know what the first #1 solution is? I feel like this is some like perverted version of Family Feud here. Like the #1 survey response was recycling. Maybe you want to cry. Don't get me wrong, recycling is wonderful. It is not going to solve the climate crisis. #2 response was educating people about climate change, changing lifestyles, changing your consumer habits. These are things that had nothing to do with climate change. By a 4-to-1 margin, people gave individual actions as their solutions to the climate crisis rather than political actions. Here's the really interesting thing. For every other issue we tested, every single one, immigration, abortion, education, gun violence, it was the opposite. By a 4-to-1 margin, the solutions they came up with off the top of their head were political by a 4-to-1 margin to individual. And for addressing gun violence, I think it was something like a 20-to-1 margin. The reason I've taken so much time talking about this poll is it's generated an enormous amount of excitement. And honestly, we're pretty proud of it. It was expensive, but we crafted it in a really cool, unique way that yielded some really extraordinary data. And what we came to realize, Carolyn, is that the reason so few environmentalists vote is that people don't think of the climate crisis as a political issue. They think of it as an individual issue. They think that the climate crisis is our own personal fault, and because of that, we don't address it through political systemic change. Instead, we address it by changing what type of sweater we buy at the Gap or recycling more often. And you can probably hear the frustration in my voice. We all know what this is due to. It is a sophisticated, decades-long PR campaign by the fossil fuel industry, convincing us that the climate crisis is a suicide rather than a homicide. They didn't want us to blame them. They wanted us to blame ourselves, and it's worked. We do blame ourselves, and this polling data that we recently got back proves it. And it's very clear that that has created a depoliticized climate movement. And we need to change that. We need to start making people realize that the climate crisis is a systemic global issue that requires systemic political solutions. That's why environmentalists aren't voting, Carolyn, and we've got to change it. You asked something that really got my dander up here.
Well, what I loved is it's a classic question, but we have a better answer than we've really ever had. So really appreciate you asking, Carolyn. All right. I don't know that this is much easier, Nathaniel, but Virginia and Christine have kind of asked some similar questions. What would you say our limiting factor to growth is across our voter contact methods? Like right now, what's keeping us from sending more mail? What's keeping us from sending more digital or more postcards?
Great questions, Virginia and Christine. Okay, what's limiting us from sending more mail? Money. That's it. Money. For each new mail piece, maybe it takes an extra hour of design time and maybe, I don't know, 4 to 6 hours of list building time from Peter doing his data magic. It takes almost no additional time at all. It's just money. Same thing for digital ads. It's just money. Nothing else. Money, money, money. That's it. All right. Phone calls. More volunteers. More volunteers. We, you know, have a whole bunch of extraordinary volunteer leaders, and I think many of you have met them. These are people who have gotten trained on our messaging, know the calling platform, and are extraordinarily good. Extraordinarily. I can brag about this because it's not something I'm good at and I don't do this. I can brag about these other people. Oh my God, are they so good at taking a group of people of lots of different experience levels and understanding of technology and making them feel comfortable, not only with calling strangers, which, let's face it, is not everybody's cup of tea, but with our messaging that has been proven to work. And then getting them ready to go ahead and make that first call. And the extraordinary thing is once you talk to a voter, you realize how easy it is, and you keep on going and you keep on going. And so because, Christine and Virginia, we have these great volunteer leaders and a great organizing staff with Shannon and Ren and Irene, we can still, we could probably, I don't know, triple the number of phone bank attendees, quadruple the number of phone bank attendees without having to get additional staff or dramatically more volunteer leaders. There really isn't much limiting there. So there, it's just the number of volunteers. If you can bring more volunteers to us, we can put them to work. We don't need to hire more people. We don't need to make more processes happen. We are ready for them. So those three things, mail, digital, phone calls, really, really easy to scale up. Fourth, door-to-door canvassing. We only do door-to-door canvassing in places where we have really high canvassable density. That means regardless of the election, even year, odd year, we think we will have a lot of targets that people can reach quickly and easily. By which I mean, like, they don't need to go up into a high rise or get into a gated community, or they don't need to walk a mile between each door. That means that we are door-to-door canvassing in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, and in Arlington, Virginia, sort of Northeast Virginia area. We would love to start canvassing in the Atlanta, Georgia area as well. We've got great canvassable density there. As some of you might remember, we had been canvassing as well in Austin, Texas, and in Tucson, Arizona. The sad truth is, because of the climate crisis, it is just consistently too hot to canvass in Tucson and often in Austin anymore. We had to cancel so many canvasses last year. And it got to the point where we felt kind of stupid that we were like an environmental group who couldn't see this coming. Like, of course, we're going to have to cancel the next one too, guys, and the next one too. And unfortunately, the only times of year where it's not blazing hot happen to be the times when there aren't that many elections going on. There aren't many reasons to knock doors in December and January. And so that's why we have pulled back on door-to-door canvassing there. But we're doing it strong in those other places. What would it take to scale up there? We've got great canvassing leaders. We can get as many more volunteers knocking on doors in those areas as you can give us. We had some canvasses last fall in Philly and Pittsburgh that I think had 30 people, 35 people knocking on doors, and we could get bigger than that. Okay, final thing, postcards. I saved this for last because it's harder to scale. I'm sure many of you who have written postcards with us, and maybe some of you haven't written postcards with us, have done postcards or letters with other organizations. I am confident, even though I haven't done it because I've read about the stuff that they do, that in many ways those other organizations are a little bit more turnkey of an operation. You just kind of write what you want on what you want and send it when you want. That's probably being a little bit too blasé, but it's close to the truth. Some of them are a little bit better. They tell you exactly what to say. But you can download the information. You can do it yourself. We don't do it that way. We don't do it that way. Because we want to make sure that when we ask you to do anything, that we're not wasting your time. We only want to ask you to do something if we have randomized control trials proving that it works. And as some of you might remember, this is another example of us saying no. For 2 years, our volunteers asked us, when are you going to do postcards? When are you going to do postcards? And thank you. We love that you ask us to do more. Like, we really do. I don't want you to take this the wrong way. But all of these organizations that were doing postcards, whenever we asked to see randomized control trials showing statistically significant results, they shrugged. There weren't any. It was only about 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, we started to see some data that made us think, okay, maybe we can do this. And we started doing it in small batches, and you saw some of those results. They were too small to yield statistically significant results, as Shannon mentioned, but they were all pointing in the right direction. And we said, okay, let's go big. And then we started getting statistically significant results on all the loss aversion mail, and it was working, and it was great. But now all we know is that this precise design with this precise language works. And when we try other stuff, it doesn't necessarily work. And with other organizations, when they try other stuff, it doesn't necessarily work. And so what this all leads to, Virginia and Christine, is that it's a hell of a lot harder to scale up volunteer postcards the way we do them. Because what we want to do is tell you exactly the right design to use, exactly the right language to write on there, and exactly the right time to mail that card. Not because we're being persnickety, and not because I like saying the word persnickety, although I do, but because we know that you're only doing this because you actually want to make a difference. And that's why we're doing it too. So that is something that would be harder to scale up. What stands in the way of us scaling up our postcarding efforts would probably mean hiring either an additional person or half an additional person. And we would probably want to ramp up some of our volunteer recruitment efforts. There are some times where we have more than enough volunteers to do postcards and other times we don't. But volunteer postcards is the hardest thing to scale up. Great, great question.
All right. I got a final question for you, Nathaniel. And I think that'll transition well to the last things you have to say. If someone is considering making a monthly donation or a one-time donation of the same amount that they would donate in a year, which is better for EVP?
Oof. Wow, great question. So what is real? So right now we are in a unique time where over the next 4 weeks, we're going to have to finalize our budget for what will ultimately be probably 80% of our expenditures this year. And so, yeah, like every dollar literally will change our budget. So this might be the only time when I would say, well, maybe a one-off donation would be better. But if we weren't in this 4-week window, it would be the monthly contributions. And the reason is this. As I alluded to earlier this evening, this isn't just boom bust from year to year. We raise less in odd years than we do in even years. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there have been a lot of environmental groups that have had to have tons of layoffs. There have been some that have gone through even harder problems than that, and certainly a lot of political groups that have gone through that. We've been able to avoid that because we have such a robust monthly donor program. And let me sort of bring you into my life, not just as an executive director, but as the person who does most of the fundraising. we raise most of our money in July, August, September, and October, because that's when everybody has politics on their brain, right? Because most of the big elections tend to happen in November. And yeah, we are in this, year-round habit-forming business, but let's face it, most people don't like wake up in February really worried about the election like they do in September or October. So this is where we raise most of our money. But when it comes to November and December and January and February, there are still some really important things going on. First, part of the reason we've been able to remain so efficient is that we have an amazing, happy, continuous staff that doesn't have to be laid off and then new people brought in and trained. And so we need to pay them when the donations aren't necessarily coming in. Another important thing, there are really important elections that happen in February and March. I mean, who knows? Let's take Texas for an example. Texas almost always has their statewide primaries the first Tuesday in March. Now, they might change it this year because of all the redistricting, and they might have to push it back. But North Carolina typically has really early primaries. There are a lot of really important elections. I mean, Texas and North Carolina might be two of the most important 2026 elections, and they're having statewide primaries in early March. That means that Shannon needs to start thinking, oh, are we going to do volunteer postcards into those places? She needs to start thinking that at like December and start planning then. We need to start figuring out, when are we going to schedule phone banks and things like that. All of this stuff is paid for with these monthly donations. It makes budgeting so much easier, and it helps us take advantage of these really golden opportunities that often other groups can't take advantage of. And that gets to the third and final reason. The Environmental Voter Project isn't just unique in that we look for these opportunities. We're unique in that we're really one of only a handful, and that's even being generous, organizations who are going to be mobilizing voters in these races. And so when it comes to mobilizing folks in local elections in Maricopa County, Arizona next February, I can guarantee you no one else is going to be doing it. But if we've got those monthly donations coming in, we will be doing it. And we'll be able to make brand new climate first voters when everybody else is asleep. And we'll roll into next fall with them like an army. All right. Thank you. I cannot believe how many people stayed on for this extended Q&A. It's this weird thing where like people say that they want something, but you don't believe them because like who would want to sit around for that? But you did. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are now going to finish up. We're going to finish up by me just once again sharing this screen. Please, folks, you are here for a reason. You have outed yourself by showing up to an Environmental Voter Project fundraiser. You have outed yourself as someone who cares deeply about the climate crisis and cares deeply about the democracy crisis and wants to do something to make a difference. We have proven results. Our data tells us that we can easily and efficiently scale up right now. We are now entering into our first period of rapid growth at the Environmental Voter Project, and our data is screaming at us that we can double or triple our size if you help make it happen. There is no limit on the amount you can donate. And so I am not at all anxious or ashamed to ask you to donate generously. We will take $1 million donations. We will take $5 million donations, but we will also take $5 and $10 or $20 donations and monthly donations. And the last thing I will just say is thank you. Thank you to all of you, not just for your time, but for your indefatigable efforts. I have so much admiration for all of the activists who all of us work with each day. And in such a scary, lonely moment in time, I can't tell you how much I value the solidarity that comes with working with all of you. So thank you. What we are going to do now is we are going to leave this Zoom open so that if you want to make a donation, you can go into the chat and make that donation. We're going to leave this Zoom open for about 2 minutes, but all of us are going to go off video, and then we will close out the entire Zoom. So you've got a few more minutes to click that link and have it open, and then we will close things. Have a good night, folks.